Welcome back. A federal judge's decision to block federal officials from communicating with social media companies has a lot of people talking, but it comes as several other big court cases are making national headlines. Let's bring in our guest tonight, public interest attorney Kevon Schroff, who's up late with me tonight on the Final Five to talk about that and more. Good to see you again.
Great to join.
We'll get to that social media lawsuit in a moment here because that came out during the holiday weekend. But I want to go back to Friday because there is a case, and you talked about this on social media over the weekend. And just so people at home know what we're getting at here, this has to do with Smith versus Colorado, which is that decision that permitted the website designer to deny services to a gay couple. Turns out this person in this alleged couple apparently did not exist. One of the men was contacted by the New Republic. He said, "Oh, I'm already married to my wife of 15 years. It all comes down to the group that brought this suit, the Alliance Defending Freedom, and one of their senior counsels, Erin Hawley, who is the wife of Josh Hawley, the senator from Missouri. Now there's calls for her to be sanctioned."
Absolutely. I think, there's a whole range of sanctions that could take place here for any of the lawyers involved in really perpetuating this fraud on the court, depending on the level of knowledge that they had and the certain facts. Certainly this merits an investigation and further, looking into. But the range of sanctions could be you can't practice in front of the Supreme Court anymore, or you could be referred to your local bar association, and that could lead to either sanctions or even disbarment. And perhaps most extreme, you could face criminal charges for filing, a false filing with a court of law. And that's not even to mention sort of the avenues that Stewart, who's now been dragged into this really dark piece of history and a national case, right, has to sue for defamation or other violations of his privacy. So certainly could expect some harsh consequences here.
Obviously, when that ruling came down and we learned about it on Friday, I think judging by where we've seen decisions come from this court over the last year, which obviously started with Dobbs and now continuing through a couple decisions last week, student loans, Smith v. Colorado. It's not a surprise, I think, for a lot of people to see the court coming down like this. But you had said the extreme court used the totally made-up case to illegitimately strip away LGBT plus rights. So where does it go from here? And considering the balance, do you think that there is even going to be any attempt for any sort of sanctions to be brought against Erin Hawley if it's merited here?
It's not only the justices that could, refer these issues, but I do think that, you're talking about the balance of the court here. This is all happening at a time of the least trust and public support for this court. There is an absolute legitimacy crisis that's precipitated under John Roberts. And the idea that you're going to use false information to strip away people's rights. And as you mentioned, this decision was sort of news dumped on people. Hey, you're losing some rights. Happy July 4th, as people go away for a long weekend. I think it's disgraceful. And then, one possible area to pursue, and I think this should be done just to do it and have the justices on the record, is that within 25 days of a decision, you can petition for a rehearing. And this has been done historically when there have been factual inaccuracies in cases. So I think that absolutely they should push for this. The Colorado Attorney General should make that request and, have the justices on record that they want to stand by this false information to rip away the rights of millions of Americans.
You mentioned Colorado's Attorney General, and clearly attorneys general are primary, the ones who are bringing a lot of these cases forward. And that brings us to what happened on Tuesday, which again is another thing that kind of got dumped on all of us as we were enjoying the holiday weekend. There was a lawsuit brought forth by the Republican Attorneys General of Louisiana and Missouri, all about how the Biden administration interacted with social media companies about so-called protected speech here. And it sort of put up a firewall now, at least for the time being. This all has to do with how the administration addressed concerns about the masks and vaccines during the pandemic here. But what sort of precedent do you think this sets now?
I think it's an alarming precedent. And if you look at the analysis, there's been great analysis on this. There seems to be almost no cases to support what this judge, Terry Doughty, did here, a Trump-appointed judge who basically told the Biden administration, not only can they not talk to social media companies, they can't talk to thought-leading groups and think tanks that are trying to help reform and manage our digital infrastructure as we're dealing with the very real crises of disinformation, the spread of public public health misinformation, all of those areas. Now, the judge did make an exception for national security issues, but offered really no guidelines here. So a lot of government officials who would otherwise be communicating with Twitter or Facebook about, hey, this person might be a threat, or hey, this is something we need you to take down, it's a security concern, don't know where the line is, and that's incredibly dangerous. And I think stepping back, I mean, this really reads as if this guy, you know, read essentially the Twitter files, which, if you remember, Elon Musk's own Twitter lawyers argued in court were fake and not true, and basically has gone down on this culture war line of, you know, no social media moderation. I think it's incredibly dangerous and a very strange interpretation of the First Amendment, basically saying that any interaction, any partnership between the private sector and the government could amount to censorship or coercion if the government's giving feedback in any way.
You know, and this brings to mind, obviously, a new frontier in which we see these private entities or these companies working with the federal government in some way, shape, or form. And I can think back to the 80s where you had the government working with broadcast networks for an anti-drug campaign that obviously has worked. Many people can argue it's worked maybe not the way that they expected it to over the years. But is there a difference between, say, the government talking to NBC, CBS, Fox about here's the messaging we want to put forth about drugs, and what they put out towards social media about COVID?
Not really. I think it's an apt comparison, and certainly, again, to the point of, you know, this is really considered a ruling, an order without premise. So I think we can look to several historical examples and see the ways that, especially when it comes to a public health crisis, a one-of-a-kind, hopefully, public health crisis that, you know, the government is reacting to in real time, I think to strip them of this ability would literally cost lives. I mean, imagine we were in a pandemic right now. This would be costing lives. So incredibly dangerous.
And just before we go, so just based on what you've seen so far, what's the next step for something like this?
You know, I think the Department of Justice has sort of said we need to collect ourselves and see our options here. I think they might not have expected such a radical decision from this judge. And I think, you know, to the extent that social media companies want to voluntarily do better, and now they might want to go seek out, you know, why is the Election Integrity Project something that a judge wouldn't want the Biden administration talking to, but, you know, Facebook can go reach out directly, and they obviously do partner with these groups all the time. So hopefully it'll be some self-regulation, but a reminder that we can't keep relying on these social media companies to regulate themselves. And we do need real action from Congress and our other government leaders on this issue. So
yeah, it all depends on who's in command and who wants to see that happen. That's Kai Von Schroff joining us here on The Final Five. Good to see you again, my friend. Thanks for joining me.
You as well.
And The Final Five is back after this.
I walk a lonely road.